Welcome to ASCM's The Chain Podcast. On this episode, I'm really pleased to be joined by my guest, Brian David Johnson. Brian is a leading futurist and a threatcaster. I know that may sound unusual to a lot of people, but that is his job. He's worked with premier tech corporations to help them build their resiliency by studying trends and data to peer into the future and see how that affects what we do today. Brian, thanks for joining me today.
Abe, it's a pleasure to be here.
As always, I always enjoy talking to you. I'm not sure if I'm more scared after I talk to you or if I'm more relieved after I talk to you. But we've worked on a number of engagements for ASCM and supply chain. Was supply chain always a part of threat casting and future casting, or has this become a recent phenomenon?
Well, I think it'd probably be good to explain to the audience that as a futurist and an applied futurist, what I do is I work with organizations, Abe, just like you said. So I don't do capital F futures. I am a professor at Arizona State University, but I generally don't do kind of academic futures. I'm always working with an organization. So I'm working with them to look at a range of possible and potential futures, whether they be positive or negative, and then to say, okay, what do we need to do about it to either go towards that positive future or disrupt that negative future? And for me, Dave, when it was a supply chain, when I was the chief futurist at the Intel Corporation, and they're there because it takes them about 10 years to design, develop, and deploy a microprocessor, a chip. And so that was my job. I'm an engineer and a designer by training. And so really it was my job to say, okay, here's what people would want to do with technology 10 years in the future. And to date myself, Abe, as you know, they brought me in to do smart TV. So I was one of those crazy people in the early 2000s who said we would use computers to watch television. And so being at Intel, right, it was a massive supply chain that's going on. And so we had some conversations about supply chain, but for us, the reckoning was 2011. So the big Japanese earthquake, certainly the Fukushima problems, high-tech kind of technology firms, that really showed a lot of the stressors and the cracks where we thought we had a diversified supply chain. Turns out it wasn't. We were single sourcing and it was a lot of problems. And so that's where I really started doing a lot of work with supply chain, thinking about our supply chain because we had that break. And to your point, Abe, as we kind of moved up, and certainly as we, you and I have been working together now since 2016, kind of thinking about supply chain. But of course, as we got into COVID, I think that's just really brought it front and center. And so now everybody, I think most people can see that everything is a supply chain problem.
So let's dig into that. I think most people understand scenario planning in terms of, okay, what could happen in the future, especially within supply chain. That's a fairly well-established, process for organizations to try to predict what is going to occur. How does that differ between threat casting and future casting from scenario planning?
I think the difference when it comes to future casting and threat casting is you're going 10 years out into the future and you're looking at a range of possible and potential futures. Whereas in scenario planning, you're really just looking at 4 possible futures. You're kind of looking at, what happens if this factor and that factor come in, or this factor and that factor come in. You kind of are getting 4 different things that could happen. And although that's very helpful, what future casting and threat casting is doing is trying to get a much wider range of possible and potential futures. Oftentimes when I do this with organizations, we could come up with 10, 15, 20, 30 different futures. And some of them are pretty crazy, Abe. I mean, some of them are get right up to the edge of the impossible. And that's what we're trying to do, is to get that broader range and then begin to backcast. And then that's where we get into scenario planning. That's where actually organizations can say, oh, okay, if this is this bad, nasty future that could happen, and then let's backcast it over the next 5 to 10 years. All right, let's look at 5 years from now and let's scenario plan that. So it's really a part of many tools that people use when they're trying to understand their future.
Interesting point, because as you're pointing out, our scenario planning revolves around our current processes, our current demand, our current supply. What you're talking about is bringing in data points that generally are not considered within organizations. How do you know where to start and where to end in terms of all the data points that are out there?
Well, the thing about the method of threat casting and for future casting is we always have a research question. So it's always really bounded. And for those data nerds who kind of love looking at nerds, it's a constrained data set. We're not doing all the futures. We're not looking at all the data. We really are looking at a set of data where we can go and try to answer a research question, right? It's what are future threats from a certain thing, or what are possible markets or things like that. And so we keep that. And then as a part there, I do subject matter expert interviews. So I'll go out and interview people because, the future is built by people. And so I'll go out and have conversations with social scientists, certainly with technologists, but I'll talk to cultural historians, which I think is really helpful. We do talk to economists and geopolitics. And I think that's a big deal, is going and getting everybody's different perspective, because oftentimes there's no ground truth. It's just, what do people think, and what are they working on? What do they think is happening? And so oftentimes I'll do all of those interviews. And then a big part of threatcasting, and Abe, you and I have done this before, is we get practitioners together to do it. So it's not just me. I would never tell an organization I'm so arrogant as to know their future. We get together and actually get people, working on a person in a place experiencing this threat, and we break them into small groups so we get all these different perspectives. And so what happens, we come out, we have a lot of data points answering that, and we use that to synthesize it together to start coming back with reports and action plans and things like that.
It's interesting because you're pointing out that you're bringing in non-traditional voices into a process that most supply chain professionals don't take the time to consider the implications of it. But bring me back to your personal place concept, because I think that grounds a lot of the future casting into actionable items. Give me a sense of what that looks like.
So as I said, we gather all this information, and then we break people into small groups, and we go from this macro, this very, very high level, to pick a single person in a single place experiencing a problem. And what that allows us to do is get very detailed and very specific. But as we all know, especially in supply chain, who you are and where you are really, really matters. And that's okay. It's not saying, again, that there is one truth to rule them all. No, we know that we allow people to really get into the details of a single person in a single place experiencing it. And then another group on the same data set is going to pick a different person in a different place experiencing the threat. And so that then gives us so many different perspectives. And it also frees people up. As you said, we get all these different perspectives because they're not trying to come up with the correct answer, right? If it's only a single person in a place experiencing something, then you can really get into the details, the second and third order effects. And oftentimes that's when the really interesting things come out. That's when the crazy stuff comes out. That's when we get a little bit into the impossible, because it's just a single person. And we go 10 years out to kind of give people a little bit more breathing room. And we do that multiple times. So we make sure that people say, okay, you've now picked a single person in a place experiencing this threat. Now, great, you've done that. Now pick a new person in a new place experiencing the same threat or a different threat. So it allows people to really stretch their imaginations. And that's something that they don't normally get the platform or the permission to do, which is what people really like about threat casting is, as you said, it's those really disparate inputs. Sometimes we even use science fiction. Sometimes we use all these different things to get these inputs. And then it's people in a really comfortable atmosphere really trying to get way down into the details very, very quickly, because that then gives us a much more detailed set of data that we can then synthesize and turn into an action plan.
Interesting. You brought up a point there that I want to dig into a little bit. You say that not often, these individuals don't often get into this type of conversation. As we've seen, supply chains used to be a back office. I mean, these were the problem solvers. If there was a problem, the first call was going to be the supply chain professional in terms of why didn't it get there? Why didn't it get produced? Where's my raw materials? Where's my inventory? Then COVID hit. And now everybody is at least aware of supply chains, but not really a deep understanding of what makes it work. So now we've got this situation where now everybody is at least aware of the supply chain implications. Give me a sense of how that plays out in the real world in terms of how do we see impact of supply chain on the consumer, on the economy? What are clear indications that we've got a problem?
I think a lot of it is, especially I think when it came to COVID, I mean, you and I went through that together and really trying to work with the members of ASCM and really trying to think about that, because as you said, it was in the back office, and then all of a sudden it was at the kitchen table because there was no toilet paper, because there were no problems. And we know, working in in supply chain how that happens. But for the average person, that's really, really frightening. That's really frightening because they have known it for so long, and they don't realize not the fragility, but just the complexity of it. And I think because of that, it showed the complexity that people really did start to get an understanding, and people started having conversations about the bullwhip, and people had conversations about, well, why is that like that? And why is it like that in certain countries and other countries and things like that? So I think it provided people, unfortunately, with kind of a wake-up call and understanding that supply chains are organic, they are elastic, they are fragile sometimes, they can be very strong sometimes, and kind of getting that understanding. And then I think you can add to that where people started getting things a lot more with home delivered, where then the supply chain was coming to their front door, and it was coming, and them getting an understanding, okay, what does that mean, instead of going down to the local supermarket or the local warehouse. And that's one of the things that when I was doing work on the future of shopping many, many years ago, one of the retailers that I knew who was really trying to create a retail experience said the most shopping wasn't actually shopping. Most shopping was you were a part of the supply chain. You were just going to a warehouse, picking up your milk and eggs, and then taking it home. You were kind of shopping, but it wasn't really retail. You were actually then a part of that supply chain. So I think people got to sort of see themselves set in a much more complex web of what it means to be a participant in supply chain.
It's interesting. We just completed a documentary, and one of the quotes that was in there is that consumers and all of us, we expect full shelves. Every time we walk into a supermarket, we expect full shelves. We're not surprised that there are full shelves. We expect it. And I think that the scarcity of, product and availability really reset the consumer's understanding of supply chain. You dig into that a little bit in the future casting in terms of what are the implications of empty shelves. Give me your little vignette on that.
Well, it's very visceral, right? And it's something that we all kind of live through. And so I'm also a science fiction author, so I write science fiction stories. I'm a huge science fiction nerd, big science fiction film nerd. And I like to tell people that in like a zombie apocalypse movie or something like that, if you go into the supermarket and there's no toilet paper and the shelves are empty, you feel like the world is ending. You feel like everything is broken down. And people felt that. I mean, people get that fear. And of course, we've seen it not just with COVID and toilet paper, certainly when we know we're going to have climate events like hurricanes or natural disasters. We see that with water. We see people having runs just because the supply chain gets out of balance. But I think it gives people a really visceral feeling. You're right, because not only do they expect full shelves, but even in our fiction, in the story we tell ourselves, if the shelves are not full, something is radically wrong. The world is about to come to an end if the supermarket isn't stocked. And that is something that is just ingrained in our kind of cultural phenomenon. We use it as storytellers as a way to show that there's something really, really bad has gone on because there's nothing there. But it's true. And I think that does strike fear in the hearts of people when they see that, because they do expect it. And it actually goes back to, food scarcity. It goes back to the stability of our communities and the stability. I mean, you could really read into that. It's very important because, again, so much of American consumer culture, but really Western consumer culture, is full shelves, is what you want when you want it, always having it there, is abundance. And when we see that abundance is lacking, it can strike fear into the hearts of us, much like a zombie apocalypse.
It's interesting because in the supply chain, we often use the COVID now as everything is pre-COVID and everything is post-COVID right now. In pre-COVID, we were a fairly efficient supply chain. I mean, just in time ruled almost every aspect of what we bought. E-commerce was strong. I mean, same day delivery, Prime was now starting to become a very key part of our, the consumer's buying experience right now. We were inefficient. I mean, high variety, reasonable cost, rapid delivery. What else could you ask for? But yet we were living on a razor's edge in terms of how efficient the system was. There were significant latent issues within the supply chain that we never paid attention to because it was efficient. Did we become complacent?
I think we got used to a system, and and if a system works, it works. And we think it's right if it works. To your point, The system was very inefficient. The system had flaws. The system had cracks. I mean, anybody who's way down in the trenches of supply chain know that it's a constant battle. It's a
Yeah.
constant spinning plate. So try to making everything kind of work out. But I think as you abstract it, it worked, to your point. It was working. So if it ain't broke, don't fix it, right? Well, the stress on the system that COVID put, we had seen those stresses before, as I mentioned, with climate disasters, with things like that. We'd seen them, but they'd only been regional.
Yeah.
And that's one of the things, Abe, that you and I talked about to the ASCM members and talked about to everybody. We have dealt with disruptions before, but not a global disruption that happened all at once and pretty much not overnight, but very fast. And in that, it was kind of like some of my students are emergency room doctors and things like that, getting them to think of. And then when they would tell you, and the economists that I work with will tell you the same thing, is that when that happened, it was like we had a traffic accident. There was severe trauma on our bodies or severe trauma on the supply chain. And how you start to build it back, and this is what they do in the emergency rooms and what even from an economies is they say, can we stabilize it? Can we stop the bleeding? And then we start to learn, well, what really got broken? Did you break an arm? Did you crack a rib? Did this get punctured? But you don't know right away. And you can't know because you've got to slowly build yourself back. And I think we had such a traumatic impact of that break that we didn't know what was broken. And to your point, then as we started to build things back, we saw, oh, that arm is broken. Oh, that doesn't work. And because so much stressors were put on it. And it's really a hard thing to come back from. And, anybody who's, had severe trauma, you still are recovering from it long after. And I believe we are still recovering from it. We're still trying to kind of come to grips with that trauma that we all went through. And so I don't think we got complacent. I think it worked. And so we said, okay, it works. That's great. Let's keep going. And then we had this severe trauma. And then we knew. Then we came back and you had to deal with the broken bones and the problems.
Interesting point that you're bringing up there in terms of the trauma. Let's separate the company from the consumer. Have we changed our mindset from the company's perspective in terms of the potential, the issues that we're dealing with? To your point, we can label supply chain as disruptions are us. I mean, there's just one stacked on top of another on top of another. This is the life that we live today. It's not a function of if it's going to happen. It's just a matter of when and how severe it's going to be. Have we changed our mindset in terms of the future? Because planning horizons, when we speak to a lot of supply chain professionals, they've shrunk significantly. If my planning horizon used to be 18 months, it's probably 6 to 9 months right now because of my uncertainty about what 18 months looks like. Has that changed our mindset today for companies?
I think it has. And I think that especially leaders of companies really started to understand that they need to get better at planning. They need to get better. But then also, it's not just COVID, right? It's not just coming out of a global pandemic. We had a lot of other things that are happening, right? We have multiple wars that are going on now. We certainly are seeing more and more climate effects, and we're more sensitized to what those look like. We certainly have things when it comes around technology disruptions, certainly now about AI, but there's a lot of technology disruptions as well. So I think coming out of COVID, it was also the great accelerator for many, many other things. And I think there's a lot of these factors that are in people's minds that as they're doing their planning, they're beginning to see that there is no going back.
Mhm.
And the complexity has just got ramped up. And not only the complexity, but the stakes are so much higher now because we've seen what can happen when things go terribly, terribly wrong. And we've also seen that we are, as we move into the, past the first quarter of this century, that we're living in a world that's really quite different. We're living in a world that has really fundamentally changed since the year 2000, really, as we've kind of moved out of that. And I think people have now really come to grips with all of this change that has happened in the last 25 years.
Let's go to the consumer side. In some respects, we are now conditioning the consumer on e-commerce that everything can be bought online. Have we created another, inflection point for the consumer in terms of their mindset about supply chains, in terms of my ordering, my receiving? I mean, let's be clear. Most people's understanding of supply chain is they press their, buy and looking at their door, and why hasn't it come here yet? In some respects, we've created a higher expectation.
I think so. And I think we also should break out when we talk about the consumer, there's lots of different consumers, and I know we all know that, but I do think that there's a generational difference as well. And I see this in my students. So again, I teach at a university. I also teach a lot of K through 12 as well. So I spend that's a lot of time talking to the next generation. And that consumer, whether it be the kind of millennial or the Gen Z, more Gen Z, and the ones who really haven't been named yet. So there's them, and we'll talk about them in a minute. And then you've got the boomers and the Xers and the ones who are getting older. So I think on that level, yes, it's a buy button. It's a why isn't it here? I want it, I want it, I want it. And that what was promised. I mean, so they have just been conditioned to kind of think that way. And I do think that that is there, and they have an understanding of it. And that to me is I think putting a lot more pressure. But I do think when it comes to the next generation that's coming up, they're much more sensitized to climate effects. They're much more sensitized to things like fast fashion or even just fast retail and what that means. Like they have an understanding that when I get this and this thing comes to me, that it did go through a supply chain and that it was touched by many people. And those people have lives and they've been affected. Oftentimes they've been exploited or things like that. Like understanding, and you've always been really good about this, like understanding what's in your supply chain and how much exploitation is in the supply chain and what is going on and, and what are the rare earth material. And so all those things, and I see it daily in the conversations that we have with them. And so for them, it isn't this one touch buy, it's a much deeper understanding of the culture and the mindfulness around the things that are in our lives.